It's day 3 of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers, and I'm starting to wonder if the value and power of the Enchanted Tales means that Wilds of Eldraine is the real Commander Masters. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. So it's day 3 of spoiler season, and today we got a bunch of interesting creature types to talk about. We got a bunch of fairy stuff, we got some fox elves, we got some raccoons, and another super sweet Enchanted Tales, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking about spicy new Wilds of Eldraine cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Wilds of Eldraine. We only got one new mythic today, but good lord is the card ridiculous. Might be my pick for best card from the entire set so far, and that's Virtue of Persistence, the black member of the mythic enchantment adventure cycle. So this card, it's spell side, 2-mana sorcery, Lockwing Scorn. Target creature gets -3/-3 until turn, and you gain 2 life. So some pretty decent, although not super good, early game removal. And then its enchantment side, 7-mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard on the battlefield under your control. So this card is essentially a sorcery speed last grasp, not an exciting removal spell, but a fine removal spell that then is later in the game a literal debtor's knell, or for you zoomers out there, a portal to Phyrexia, this repeatable reanimation effect. And I think what makes this card so insane is it's essentially a split card. The problem with a card like Debtor's Knell, or we've seen it in current standard with Portal to Phyrexia, is it's really hard to get a 7-mana permanent or a 9-mana permanent on the battlefield. It's just really slow. So if you draw Virtue of Persistence, in the early game, it's really a dead draw, and you might die before you ever get on the battlefield. Being an adventure solves that problem completely. This is a not awesome, but fine removal spell that then you get this upside that later in the game is just hanging out in exile, waiting till you eventually get to 7 mana, and then you play it, and it probably wins you the game if it sticks on the battlefield just by reanimating the best creature from every graveyard every single turn. That is an absurdly powerful effect. This has got to be one of the strongest cards in existence from the set for standard at a minimum. The card is so insane. So if you think about the removal in standard, the 3 big ones, Cut Down, Go for the Throat, Shieldred's Edict, there is no doubt that Virtue of Persistence is worse than these cards. It's similar to Cut Down in what it will kill, except it's a little bit more expensive and it doesn't get stuff like Rafine. It's not going to kill everything that Go for the Throat does or Shieldred's Edict does, but it's got this huge upside that none of these cards have. These spells are just removal spells. Virtue of Persistence, you get slightly worse removal, but you get this absolutely ridiculously busted enchantment on the back half in the late game. So if you look at the most popular creatures in standard, yes, there's some that this misses. It's not going to kill a Shieldred, let's say. It's not obviously going to kill like an Atraxa or something like that, but if you look at the most popular creatures, it does deal with quite a few of them. Tenacious Underdogs, very Masterminds, a decent amount of like the Black and Dimir decks, most mono white creatures, it misses Adeleine, pretty much every mono red creature except for maybe Shivan Devastator, the whole soldier deck. So really, this kills a lot, and the life gain is relevant, helping make sure that you stay alive, and that helps make up for the fact this is a sorcery. Like, you might end up taking an extra hit from something, but then you gain 2 life back, which will kind of even it out for taking that hit and having to cast this at sorcery speed. So all this to say, as removal, it's good enough that you can put it in your deck. Are you going to replace all your Go for the Throats and Shieldred's Edicts with this? No, but it's strong enough that it can be part of your removal suite, and you will be fine with it in the early game to deal with things. So fine enough as a removal spell. The big deal is the backside is ridiculous. It's literally Portal to Phyrexia. It's literally Debtor's Knell. It just sits on the battlefield, and every turn on your upkeep, you're getting back a Shieldred, or a Gix, or an Atali, or an Atraxa, and it even works on your opponent's graveyard. So if you're playing like Esper Control and you don't have any creatures in your deck, that's fine because you'll just steal whatever creatures your opponents are playing. In worst case, let's say you never get to 7 mana. Well, it was still a removal spell, so it's not going to get stuck in your hand. This card is absurd. Do not underestimate the flexibility of this card. Get some extra value in graveyard decks if you're doing the old stick fingers challenge. There's another card we'll talk about later, Bramble Familiar, that's kind of interesting with this. It's adventure side, lets you mill 7 cards and then reanimate a creature or enchantment or land from among them. So that's a way you can maybe find this and get it on the battlefield. But again, I don't think you have to be a graveyard deck for this. I think you can just jam this in Dimir or Mono Black in some numbers, or Esper Control, whatever. It's a fine removal spell that then just wins you the game later. Outside of Standard, I would play it in like Mono Black Devotion, probably, and like Pioneer or Modern or Historic, but 7 mana is admittedly a lot. I think if you know there's 0 chance you're getting to 7 mana, or like it's very unlikely that your deck's ever going to get to 7 mana, then you probably don't actually want this card. So if you're playing like a black aggro deck, let's say, where you're playing like 18 lands and all the 1-drops, I think this loses a lot of value. Like, sure, maybe something goes hilariously wrong and the game goes super long and you get to 7 mana, but in those scenarios, it's not going to be worth playing this over a better removal spell, because your odds of ever getting the enchantment side, the Virtue of Persistence side, is just too low. But if you're a deck that can make a bunch of mana, like a Devotion deck, then I think this is worth it. Sure, you're downgrading your removal a little bit, but you get this bomb in the late game that can win you the game. As far as Commander is concerned, I think this card's going to be really, really good there as well. The removal is kind of medium. It's mostly picking off like mana dorks, utility creatures. It does hit some commanders, but there's a lot of big creatures in Commander. So as a removal in Commander, it's definitely very medium, but in Commander, you're ramping a lot. It's going to be pretty easy to get to 7 mana, and then this is a really strong effect. So I think that enchantment decks would consider this, maybe like the new Narky deck or Zur Eternal Schemer, turn into a creature and beat down. Reanimator decks like Crocs and Kunaros, or just like graveyard value decks like Madrotha or whatever. This seems like a fine addition there. So Virtue of Persistence, to me this card seems kind of ridiculous. Like, it's scary to me that maybe the best cards from Wilds of Eldraine are also black cards and are already in a Standard that isn't rotating for some reason, that is really dominated by black cards. But I do not see a world where this is not ridiculously strong in Standard. Like, how can it not be? The removal's good enough, and then the backside is game ending enough that I don't know why you would not put some number of these in your black deck. Maybe you're only playing 2 copies or something like that, because you still need to go for the throats and the cut downs, but this card seems ridiculous to me. So Virtue of Persistence, my pick so far for one of the strongest cards from the set, and I expect we will be seeing a lot of this card. Adventures are ridiculous, and this card is especially ridiculous. Next up, we got a new white rare in Werefox Bodyguard. So a 3 mana 2/2 Fox Elf Knight, quite the creature type line on that one. It has flash. When it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target non-Fox creature until it leaves the battlefield. Then you pay 2 mana, sack it, and gain 2 life. So there's a couple of immediate questions about this card. First, why non-Fox creature? The answer I think there is, it would be very easy for this to loop with itself. Like, it doesn't say creature your opponent controls. So in theory, if it didn't say non-Fox, you could play this and just keep exiling itself forever for infinite ETBs. 2 of them would loop each other. The other question is, why would I ever want to sacrifice my Brutal Cathar type creature? Isn't the goal of these cards to keep them on the battlefield for as long as possible so they keep working as removal? And the answer is normally yes, but Werefox Bodyguard is kind of unique. So Brutal Cathar is kind of the baseline for this effect in Standard, where it comes into play, gets rid of one of your opponent's creatures, maybe it flips and gets bigger and exiles another thing. The sneaky part of Werefox Bodyguard is it can exile your own creatures. So imagine your opponent has a Shieldred, you can flash in your Werefox Bodyguard and get rid of it. That's pretty good, but something that Werefox Bodyguard can do that Brutal Cathar can't do is if you have a Shieldred and your opponent goes to kill your Shieldred, you can flash in your Werefox Bodyguard, exile your Shieldred, and then if you want your Shieldred back, you can just pay 2, sack the Bodyguard, gain a couple of life, get your Shieldred back into play. And that's what makes me excited about this card. I think the fact that this is probably a little bit worse than Brutal Cathar overall at exiling your opponent's creatures, but way, way better than Brutal Cathar, which literally can't exile your own creatures. It's saving your own creatures actually makes this pretty appealing. The closest comparison might be Sigrid Godfavored, but that card had way too many restrictions, being legendary, needing to be cast during combat. I think that Werefox Bodyguard is on par with Brutal Cathar, and situationally just better than Brutal Cathar, depending on the deck. So where would you play this in Standard? As far as its creature types, I think Night Tribal is the only one of these that's actually relevant, maybe for Standard. We do have some pieces to make Knights worse, Invasion of New Phyrexia, Virtue of Loyalty, Marshal of Zhalfir, so maybe we see a Knight deck develop. That seems like a possibility, but like I said, you don't need to be playing this based on its creature type. This is just a fine card in any white creature deck. There is some 2-for-1 potential as well. You can do some shenanigans where, like, your opponent attacks with a Spirited Companion to Sarah Paragon, you flash in the Bodyguard, exile the Paragon, block the Spirited Companion. That's a lot of value for a 3-mana 2/2, so I think Werefox Bodyguard seems like the kind of card that should have a decent amount of potential in Standard. Brutal Cathar's been very good at various times. This has some upside compared to Brutal Cathar, saving your own creatures, having flash, so to me this looks like the kind of Banisher Priest effect that could actually be pretty good in Standard. We also got a new legendary rat in Lord Skitter Sewer King. So a 3-mana 3/3 says when a rat enters the battlefield under your control, exile up to 1 target card from an opponent's graveyard, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. So Lord Skitter, if you think about it, it's kind of a 3-mana 4/4. You play it, you go to combat, you get the 1/1. The 1/1 obviously is about as bad as a creature token can be. Like, it's a 1/1 and it can't even block, so it doesn't get much worse than that, but still, it's adding a reasonable amount of power to the battlefield, and the next turn you go to combat, it'll make another rat. So the question is, can rats actually work in Standard? We have one of the best rat cards for Constructed of all time in our current Standard format, and Chromonix the Rat King. The problem is there's just not enough good rats to support it. Lord Skitter, I think, is immediately like the second best rat in Standard, so maybe we'll see a deck with rats that develop around these two legends. We'll have to see. How would you actually go about making rats work? I think one possibility is maybe you focus on the Toxic from Chromonix and try to, like, play Chromonix, use Lord Skitter to make a bunch of tokens. Sure, they can't block, but you want to attack with them anyway. Get in some toxic poison counters on your opponent, and then just proliferate your opponent to death. The other thing about Lord Skitter that I think is interesting is because we're going into a Standard with the bargain mechanic, and I would argue bargain is probably the strongest mechanic in Wilds of Eldraine, but we're going into a Standard where useless tokens are actually going to be pretty valuable. We talked before about how a 1/1 rat that can't block is literally as bad as a creature token can be. Like, you really can't make a creature token that's less powerful than that. But if your plan is to sack it to Beseech the Mirror and tutor up the best card from your deck and play it for free, or sack it to a Realm Scorcher Hellcut and get this massive Hasty Dragon and some mana back, it doesn't really matter. Like, the worse your token is, the better in some sense if you're bargaining it anyway. So the fact that this is just every turn make a token to bargain, I could see that having some pretty nice implications in Standard. It curved really well into Beseech the Mirror, 3-drop Lord Skitter, make the token next turn, Beseech, get your, I don't know, Sheoldred in your rat deck apparently, because Sheoldred is just so busted. But I think the bargain mechanic makes this card way better than you'd think. On the other hand, in Commander, I think this card's actually, like, pretty bad as your commander. So I would play this in the 99 of a rat deck every single time. I think we always talk about how you should play more Graveyard Hate in Commander, and this is a, like, decent tribe member that also acts as Graveyard Hate. The rat token's gonna trigger it to exile something, so it works as Graveyard Hate, and it's also, like, just a pretty good rat, because there's not that many good rats in Magic. But as your commander, I think this card's actually pretty boring. Like, I would play Chromonix above it, Marinar above it, Ashcot above it, maybe even some other rats. So this is probably, like, the 5th best or 6th best rat commander, but in the 99 it does seem pretty good. So Lord Skitter, I like this card. I'm still not sure. We'll have to see how many rats we get. Can there be a rat deck in Standard? Gonna have to wait and see. Do we get enough support to make it work? But this does get us a step closer. It does have some sneaky synergies with the bargain mechanic, with the token, and good in the 99 in Commander at least. We also got Ingenious Prodigy. So a blue and X human wizard. It's a 0/1. It has Skulk for some reason. I didn't even know he did Skulk anymore. I thought that was gone, but Skulk is back apparently. Everyone should celebrate. Ingenious Prodigy enters the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on it, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, if it has one or more counters on it, you can remove a +1/+1 counter from it, and if you do, you draw a card. So I think the most notable part about Ingenious Prodigy is we've just never seen this scaling in blue before. Green gets a lot of one colored mana and X to make an XX. Red has like Syphon Devastator, even white has Mikaeus. I guess Endless one is kind of the colorless version, but we've never seen blue have one of these scaling creatures before. The bad news is, most of these creatures aren't very good. Even Syphon Devastator, which looks pretty bomby, is actually like kind of fringe-ish in standard. So we'll have to wait and see. I am not actually super high on this card being good. I know it can generate card advantage every turn. There are +1/+1 counter synergies in standard, but still, to draw a card with it, you gotta play it. It has to live for a turn. Then you have to start shrinking it to actually draw a card, although I guess maybe that could help with the Skulk. There are some possibilities. So like in standard, proliferates a thing, so it's a way you can keep putting counters onto it. So that's a synergy. Unbound Flourishing, other X-Spell synergies in Commander works well with Magus Luciacane since it cares about X-Spells. But my guess is this is pretty much a bulk rare that is mostly notable because blue just hasn't really got this blue and X scaling creature before. Speaking of blue and X cards, we also got a blue and double X card in Extraordinary Journey. So this one is really weird. So double blue in double X says when it enters a battlefield, exile up to X target creatures. For each of those cards, its owner may play it for as long as it remains exiled. So what this means is 4 mana, you exile one creature, but your opponent can play it. You could also exile your own creatures and you could replay it. Its other ability is whenever one or more non-token creatures enter the battlefield, if one or more of them entered from exile or was cast from exile, you draw a card. This ability only triggers once each turn. So you pay 4 mana, you exile one of your opponent's creatures, they can recast it, but you also get to draw a card. As removal, this card is downright horrible. 4 mana sorcery speed to remove one thing, eventually maybe draw a card, but your opponent can replay it. That does not seem very good to me. I guess 6 mana you get 2 things, 8 mana you get 3 things, but I think that's not the purpose of this card. I think the purpose of this card is to be a card draw engine. I think you run it out for 2 mana, and you just take advantage of this constant stream of cards as creatures enter the battlefield from exile, and then you get the upside that maybe sometimes you use it like a weird tempo play where you get a blocker out of the way by paying 4 mana and swinging for a big attack, or reuse it on one of your creatures that has a good ETB. So as removal, it's kind of like the absolute worst soul partition of all time. But remember, that's not why we're playing it. We're not playing it to be the worst soul partition of all time. We're playing it to either reuse our ETBs. I mean, we do have a Panharmonicon in standard, of being able to like play Virtue of Knowledge and then like Extraordinary Journey, your Talion, recast it and double trigger it and draw from Extraordinary Journey. Seems kind of ridiculous, but I think the main idea is this works with the adventure mechanics. So you just run this out for 2 mana in your adventure deck, and every time you cast a creature from an adventure, it's going to be being cast from exile, you're drawing an extra card. All of your adventure creatures having kicker of draw a card is actually really powerful. It's almost like Edgewall Innkeeper, the enchantment version, or remember how good Edgewall Innkeeper was in standard? So I think that's one possibility. It also seems like a plant for the Doctor Who set. If you think about what this wants, which is creatures entering or being cast from exile, the Doctor Who set is all about suspend, which is putting things in exile, casting them from exile. So I kind of feel like this is a little bit of foreshadowing of the Doctor Who set, where if you're building around the 10th Doctor or 13th Doctor or Faces of Bow or whatever, come October, this is probably going to be a really nice Phyrexian Arena style enchantment for your deck, where you occasionally maybe use it for removal or to reuse an ETB, but mostly it just sits out and draws you cards every turn as you cast things from suspend. The other place this is sneaky good, I think, is in blink decks in Commander, like Brago or Rune or Yorion. Remember, all this cares about is the creature entering from exile or being cast. So if you get down Extraordinary Journey, you can Brago, blink your stuff. When it comes back into play, you'll draw a card. Or you Rune, you blink something, it goes to exile, comes back into play, you draw a card. Also worth noting, it triggers on your opponent's creatures coming into play from exile as well. So if you, I don't know, Banishing Light something, and then your Banishing Light dies and it comes back into play, you draw a card. Or if your opponent happens to be a blink deck or an adventure deck or a suspend deck, you get value off of that as well. So I actually think Extraordinary Journey is a pretty powerful card. I think it is downright bad if you're playing this to be a removal spell. Please don't play it to be a removal spell. Play it because it's a card draw engine for your adventure deck or your suspend deck or your blink deck, and then you get this extra upside that maybe sometimes it's like the world's worst bound spell, but sometimes the world's worst bound spell is going to get that blocker out of the way so you get in a lethal attack and win the game. So play it as a 2-mana enchantment, as a card advantage engine, and then sometimes benefit from the fact that it can be an X spell. We also got, a card that I'm actually pretty hyped for, in Bramble Familiar. So Bramble Familiar, a green adventure rare. It's a elemental raccoon, these creature types getting wilder and wilder. So its adventure side is 7 mana sorcery, mill 7 cards, and put a creature enchantment or land card from among the milled cards on the battlefield. Its creature side, a 2 mana 2/2 that taps to add a green, and you can pay 2, discard a card, bounce it back to your hand. So Bramble Familiar, if you think about what this card is, it's essentially a 2 mana dork. It's a armored scrap gorger, a Llanowar Loam Speaker, but it has a really, really big upside. So the problem with mana dorks is they're very important in the early game in the decks that want them because they accelerate you into your bigger plays, but on turn 6 or 7 or 8, you really don't want to draw a mana dork. You don't want to draw your 0/3 armored scrap gorger, or your 1/3 Llanowar Loam Speaker, or your 2/2 Bramble Familiar. You want to draw something more impactful. Bramble Familiar solves this problem. In the early game, it's a Llanowar Loam Speaker that's ramping into your 4-drops and your 5-drops. If you draw it off the top in the late game, then you cast the adventure mode, Find the Way, and you're essentially getting a Turn Timber Symbiosis or Vivian's Invocation Summoning Trap, with the upside that you can also hit enchantment, so maybe you put an Omniscience into play instead of a big creature, and I think that's a pretty powerful card. So the downside is, we just really haven't seen green decks or mana dork decks be good in Standard, because of like all the good removal and the cut downs and the prevalence of black decks. Running out of mana dork on turn 2, it often just dies and doesn't actually do its job, so we'll have to see. It might not line up really well with Standard, but I will say, I believe this is just the new best 2 mana dork in Standard. Like, if you're playing a mana dork in your deck, you start here over Llanowar Loam Speaker, over Armored Scrap Gorger, because of the upside in the late game, where you're getting that Turn Timber Symbiosis MDFC mode. It's almost MDFC, except it's a mana dork and a Turn Timber Symbiosis rather than a land and a Turn Timber Symbiosis. There's also some additional upside in graveyard decks. Remember, the mill 7 card put things into play, that's actually filling your graveyard, so you're getting something back. Hopefully you're Big Atroxa or whatever, but you're also just dumping a bunch of cards in the graveyard for your Urborg Lurgoy, for to reanimate in the future with the Cruelty of Gix. So it gets even better in some sort of graveyard decks, although like I said, you could just be playing mono green Stompy, and this is gonna be worth it as a mana dork that has upside in the late game. Outside of Standard, I think its main use would be in elemental decks. Outside of Standard, 2 mana dorks, not very good. Every other format has 1 mana dorks, so there's just not really a reason to play a 2 mana dork. However, the elemental creature type might be enough for this to show up in elemental decks. If you're a Risen Reef deck in Pioneer or Modern or Historic, if you're playing Commander Elementals, an Omnath deck or a Horde of Notions deck, then I think this is worth it because it has the creature type that you care about, and you get that upside in the late game. So elementals in older formats, good mana dork in Standard. The only problem is, like I said, green and mana dorks just haven't been good in Standard, but maybe that'll change with Wilds of Eldraine. Next up, we got another white wearer in Spellbook Vendor. So 2 mana 2/2 Human Peasant has Vigilance. As the beginning comment on your turn, you can pay 1. When you do, create a sorcerer roll attached to target creature you control. If you have another roll on it, you gotta sacrifice it. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 in hands whenever this creature attacks scry 1. So Spellbook Vendor, at first glance, it looks like kind of a really bad Luminarch Aspirant. It's like a Luminarch Aspirant, except you have to pay a mana to get the roll, and then you can never put the counter on the same creature twice, or else you kind of like legend rule, essentially. Rule away the second roll. So it's kind of like a really bad Luminarch Aspirant. However, it does have a really big upside. So as a generic card in like a white weenie deck, I have a hard time envisioning this card seeing play. The upside of this card is it does make an enchantment every turn for 1 mana. So if you're playing something like Calyx that just really cares about enchantments, if you're playing Ariat that just really cares about auras on the battlefield, I could see this being a chase 2-drop. And I think this might be a good thing. I would like to see more of this in Standard. We're going to go through an adjustment period as we go to this new rotation schedule and all these changes. But I feel like more Spellbook Vendors, which are like Luminarch Aspirants in a very specific deck. Like, if you're playing auras and enchantments, this could be a really, really strong staple level 2-drop, but in just a generic deck, it's not going to be nearly as good because it's a little slow, a little bit clunky. I think that's a good spot to be compared to actual Luminarch Aspirants, which is just like the best 2-drop in any deck in its colors that's playing a bunch of creatures. So as far as playing it in generic decks, it is a human, but even just looking at mono white humans, I don't really think this makes it. There's so many strong 2-drop humans. The closest thing to a flex slot, I would say, in humans is Guardian of New Benalia. Is Spellbook Vendor better than Guardian of New Benalia? I'm leaning towards no, in all honesty, but maybe you play a couple copies. But I don't think it's beating out like Coppercoat Vanguard or Intrepid Adversary or Thalia Guardian of Thraben. And this might be one of those cards that gets a little hurt by there not being a rotation. The fact that there's 3 years of 2-drop white humans in Standard rather than just 2 years or 1 year is going to make it a lot harder for a card like this to show up in generic decks. So I think Spellbook Vendor, if your deck can take advantage of enchantments, of auras, then it's a pretty interesting card. Otherwise, probably doesn't quite make the cut in a generic deck. We also got Talion's Messenger, a new fairy, a 3-mana 1/3 fairy noble. It has flying. It says whenever you attack with 1 or more fairies, draw a card, and then discard a card. When you discard a card this way, put a +1/+1 counter on target fairy you control. So at first glance, Talion's Messenger looks like a laughably bad version of Raffine. Like Raffine, when you attack, you end up looting X and putting X counters on things. It looks a little bit silly compared to Raffine, honestly, but it does have one thing going for it, which it is a fairy, and we see fairies being a supported tribe in Wilds of Eldraine. So if there's a fairies deck, this might actually beat out Raffine. Actually, maybe it doesn't. Oh boy, imagine a Standard where people are trying to play Fairy Tribal, but they're curving Raffine into Shieldred because those cards are just so strong they beat out the actual fairies. But let's say there's an actual fairy deck, then I think this card's pretty good, and we've started to see the pieces of this develop. You got like the 1-drop in Fairy Dream Thief, you got Abora. Some of these cards, like Dream Thief, is not a bad one to loot into the graveyard anyway, so you get a bunch of card advantage. We got some holdovers like Fairy Mastermind and Halo Forger. So if fairies are a deck in Standard, then I think that Talion's Messenger is probably going to be a pretty good option in the deck. It's not quite a Lord, but it offers a decent amount of value. You do a little bit of looting, you grow your team a little bit, which is kind of what you're looking for in a tempo-y, value-y tribe like Fairies. Outside of Standard, I think it's got pretty much no chance. If you look at Fairies in a format like Modern, Fairies really want to play at instant speed. That's kind of the whole gimmick of the deck. So even though Talion's Messenger offers some value, the fact that it doesn't have Flash means I would be absolutely shocked to see this like show up in Modern Fairies. Although, we are getting Bitter Blossom on Arena for the first time, so this could be an option for like Historic Fairies, if that's a thing, which doesn't have all the cards that Modern Fairies has. So we'll have to wait and see. It could be pretty good in some sort of Bitter Blossom Fairies deck in Historic. So Talion's Messenger, decent fairy for Standard Fairies. Probably not quite good enough for other formats, though. Speaking of good new fairies, we also got Likeness Looter, and this card I really like. So, 2-mana 1/1. It's a fairy shapeshifter with flying. You can tap it to loot, draw a card, and discard a card. You can also pay X to have it turn into a copy of target creature card in your graveyard with mana value of X, except it has flying and this ability. You can only do it as a sorcery. So, Likeness Looter is essentially a Merfolk Looter mixed with Lazav's ability, where you can turn it into a creature, and I think that's a pretty powerful effect. So I was thinking about this. Okay, what do we do with this? Could we play this in Dimir midrange, which is like the best deck in Standard right now? And I think the answer could be yes. If you think about the synergies for this card, you're playing stuff like Tenacious Underdog, Razorlash Transmogrant, which is actively good in the graveyard, so you have stuff that you don't mind looting away. Looting away a Tenacious Underdog, Razorlash Transmogrant is almost like tapping Likeness Looter to draw a card. It works with Shieldred, you're triggering Shieldred when you draw a card, plus the ability to like turn into a Shieldred that died is really, really strong. This is another card that's extra copies of your best card once you loot them away or get them in your graveyard. So I could see this showing up in the current best deck in Standard, at least in some numbers. It's also a fairy, which seems like another obvious home. We'll have to see what the fairy 2-drop slot looks like. We got Abora, except how many of those can you play since it's legendary, although the effect is pretty strong. We got Fairy Mastermind, really, really strong card, but I think this is in the mix for a fairy 2-drop. Could also be good in some sort of Reanimator deck where this just comes down on turn 2 and fills your graveyard with big things for Cruelty of Grix or Lich Knight's Conquest. And it could even be an Esper Raffine style card. It seems to kind of care about the same thing. Raffine is really good at filling the graveyard. It wants cards in the graveyard. Plus, you're going to get your big powerful stuff in the graveyard. Likeness Looter can find you your big pieces, stock your graveyard, and then turn into your best thing in the graveyard. So I think that Likeness Looter as a 2-mana 1/1 flying is actually just one of the best cards we've seen from the set so far. Yeah, its stats aren't great, but it offers so much little bits of value and has so many like sneakily strong abilities attached to it that it's hard for me to imagine this card not being good in standard. So I think Likeness Looter actually has a lot of potential homes, from straight up fairy decks to mid-range decks to reanimator decks. Expect this card to be very good. Moving into the realm of lower rarity cards, we got a few that are interesting enough to mention on their own, starting with Syphon Ego. So 1-mana sorcery, target player reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card, then you exile a card from your hand if you don't control a fairy. That art is pretty epic, by the way, but this card is essentially a better Thoughtseize, because you don't lose any life if you control a fairy, and I think this could definitely have relevance in standard in specific. So the downside of this card is it's bad on turn 1, which I think that might keep it from seeing play in older formats. The best time to cast a Thoughtseize in a lot of decks is on turn 1, that's your 1-mana play. Syphon Ego, you don't really want to cast on turn 1, because then you're going to be putting yourself down 2 cards to get 1 card from your opponent's hand, so that's probably not going to be worth it. But later in the game, on turn 3 or turn 4, once you get a fairy or 2 on the battlefield, then this becomes just a better Thoughtseize that doesn't lose you any life. So I think this is very much restricted to fairy tribal decks in standard, but in those decks, I think Syphon Ego might be a really key support card. We also got the best modern card from the set, Not Dead After All. So 1-mana instant, until end of turn, target creature you control gains. When it goes to the graveyard, when it dies rather, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, then create a Wicked Roll token attached to an enchantment that gives +1/+1, and when the aura goes to the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. So why is this the best modern card in the set? It's essentially an upgraded scam piece, I think. I'm pretty sure that the Wicked Roll and the damage that you get from it makes this better than something like Fiend Death that just puts a +1/+1 counter on the creature. So I expect that once Wilds of Eldraine releases, we will see Not Dead After All in the Grief Fury scam style deck, which is currently the best deck in Modern, or one of the best decks in Modern. So yeah, just a random common, but I do expect this card will show up a ton in Modern. Does it like greatly improve those decks? No, it's a very like slight upgrade, but still, it's an upgrade after all. We also got Back for Seconds, which I'm actually pretty intrigued by. So Back for Seconds, 3-mana sorcery with Bargain, says return 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, but if it was Bargain, you can put one of those cards with mana value 4 or less onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your hand. So the fact that you can actually reanimate something with this is what intrigues me. Just getting 2 creatures back to your hand for 3 mana, not a very good deal. But 1 to your hand and 1 to the battlefield might make this worth it. If you look at the best cheap reanimation spells, they all trade up in mana. So like Unearth, for example, is 1 mana, but you can reanimate a 3-drop. So it's essentially ramping you 2 mana. Even Can't Stay Away, which we see in the Greasepain decks in like Pioneer, 2 mana, but you can get something back up to 3 mana. Back for Seconds is formatted in that way. It's 3 mana, but you can get back a 4-drop, which actually kind of scares me, because you know what costs 4 mana in Standard? There might be a card by the name of Sheoldred that everyone plays in their black decks. So the fact that this is like 3 mana, sack the Blood Tithe Harvester token, put Sheoldred back on the battlefield, and get back whatever random thing to my hand, I think this actually could make it a relevant card for Standard, and maybe even some like Pioneer-style formats as well. We also got Callous Sell-Sword, which I want to mention for one specific reason. So this is an uncommon adventure card. It's creature side, 2 mana 2/2 that enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter for each creature that under your control this turn. Whatever, that's not the reason to play this card. The interesting part is its sorcery mode, Burn Together. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to any other target, then sacrifice it. So this is like a weirdly worded fling effect. It's essentially like a thud, but your opponent can potentially target it and fizzle it with a removal spell. So normally with a fling effect, sacking the creature is part of the cost. So that means if your opponent has a targeted removal spell, it doesn't really interact with the fling kill. With Callous Sell-Sword or Burn Together, it kind of works the other way. You sack the creature after you deal the damage, so that means a targeted removal spell on your creature could fizzle it. However, there is one big upside to this. This is a fling effect, and we've seen these cards see play in various formats. Like the old adventure combo deck would tutor Thud out of the sideboard and throw a huge thing at their opponent's face to win the game. So we we have seen these cards see competitive play. The upside of this one is it's a creature. So it's a thud, but you can find it with creature-based tutors, which might actually lead to some interesting possibilities. A thud that you can find with a Eldrami's Call or whatever, that could have implications in some decks in some formats. So keep that in mind. I think overall, the formatting of Burn Together makes it worse than thud because of that risk of targeted removal blowing you out. But that might not matter if you're tutoring it up with a Eldrami's Call or whatever. We also got, everyone's gonna love this card, Ice Out. So a 3-mana counterspell, except it costs 1 less to cast if it was bargain. So it's literally counterspell if you can bargain something. And I think this card is going to have a pretty major impact on Standard. We've seen Make Disappear be very, very good in Standard, thanks to its casualty mode, which is actually kind of a lot like bargain. You can sack a creature and then you get 2 copies of it. Ice Out kind of reminds me of this, and I imagine we'll see a lot of this in the same deck, because if you're casualtying your Make Disappear, you can probably build your deck in such a way that you're also going to be able to bargain your Ice Out, and now your deck has kind of 8 counter spells in Standard. So expect this to be a card that we see a lot of complaints about in Standard, as players get a little bit tired of having all their spells countered. But really, I think this is one of the better cancel variants we've seen in a while, and it should have a pretty big impact. Of course, there's also a bunch of other low-rarity cards. Not gonna get into all of them, but you can check them all out over on MTGpreviews.com. Finally today, we got 4 new Enchanting Tales. The one that is in Japanese, if I'm wrong, I apologize to everyone. But the one that is not in English, that is a Ground Seal, some green graveyard hate. Really, outside of Ground Seal, which is kind of a fringe card that I don't know if it'll really see play, all of these cards are reprints for Magic Arena. They all already exist on there, although they are some really solid ones. Rest in Peace sees a ton of play, Phyrexian Life has uses and pretty epic art, and then Parallel Lives is super expensive. And after looking through all these Enchanted Tales, I gotta say, I kind of feel like they're the real Commander Masters in a lot of ways. It makes Commander Masters, even though, so I'm in some ways a defender of Commander Masters because it really has dropped the prices on a ton of cards, which is really, really important. But in a lot of ways, after seeing how strong these Enchanted Tales are and how many good reprints there are, Doubling Seasons and Parallel Lives and all this stuff, it really makes it kind of tough to spend $325 or whatever on a set booster box of Commander Masters when you can get a normally priced box of Wilds of Eldraine and theoretically open just as many high-end cards. Sure, you're probably not going to open them as often, but still, the fact that your $100 box has these cards in it is, I guess, very impressive. So on one hand, it makes Commander Masters look even worse based on its prices. On the other hand, it does show that Wizards is certainly willing to put very expensive reprints in normally priced boxes, which is a very good thing for players. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our Wilds of Eldraine spoilers for today. So what's your favorite card for the day? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be back tomorrow with more Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. Until then, have a spectacular day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against the Odds, where we try to put our entire deck into play on turn 3 in Legacy with Mississippi River.